community people have a really interesting perspective in the coming era of AI. We are uniquely positioned as people who really understand customers, who understand how to communicate with difficult systems, and generally speaking, have an eye towards this idea of relationship building.
Hello and welcome to the Digital Community Leaders Podcast, where we chat with community experts, uncovering insights and leaving you with practical takeaways. Today we're joined by Jake McKee, customer engagement and community consultant and founder of CX Sessions and AI Sessions. Jake has worked with or for Lego, Apple and PwC throughout his career. He continues to work with brands as a consultant, helping businesses grow an ecosystem to help them build a following of advocates. I can't wait to chat to Jake about all things community. Let's get started.
We are Steadfast Collective. We exist to craft digital applications that bring people together. A team of smart creatives, we are excited by technology and we always aim to leave the internet in a better place than we found it. Working with many of the UK's leading communities, we use technology as an accelerator to help them grow and engage their members. Our applications resource membership organisations, grow businesses and create value. We know what it takes to ship, market and scale applications, and we apply this wealth of background knowledge to everything we do. We're not just another agency, we are community builders.
Hey Jake, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
It's so good to have you here. So you're over in very warm, sunny Austin.
Correct. Yeah. Austin, Texas.
Fab. How's things over in Austin at the moment?
Hey, not bad. Like I was saying earlier, it was 70 degrees yesterday and it'll be 110 tomorrow. So, normal spring for us.
And have you always been in Austin?
No, I've been here, I think coming on 16 years. So it's been a long time. I've seen a lot of change, but no, I grew up in California and bounced around a bunch with sort of post-college and early childhood.
So I was looking through your career, and you've had a wide career. So I'm intrigued to get into that a little bit before we talk about what you're currently up to. Could you take me through it a little bit? Because I believe your community roles started at Lego. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's going back to the Lego days. I actually I'll rewind the whole tape. I went to school for product design at a school that didn't have a product design curriculum, and so I designed my own basically, and it was a combination of mechanical engineering and graphic design. And if you've ever been around either one of those two parties, much less both, you can imagine the switchover of those two was pretty dramatic. And I had to sort of go find a tree to sit in at lunchtime to switch between graphic design mornings and mechanical engineering afternoons, right? But that sort of guided my whole career. I came out of school and went straight into web development, and did that for about 4 different years at 2 different startups where we were really figuring out what web design was every day, day by day. But I sat between I was employee number 3 straight out of school at the first startup. And I sat between a designer and a programmer and turned what they did into something tangible, right? And, started really understanding, the experience patterns, customer experience and UI, UX, all that fun stuff at a time when Jacob Nielsen was not a household name, right? And that eventually led to me getting a job at Lego as a senior web producer, but fairly quickly sort of brought my interest and connection to the adult Lego community into the role. And about 2 years in, I went to my boss at the time and I said, "Hey man, I've been doing 2 full-time jobs with this, web producing stuff, but also the community stuff. I'm kind of done with the web producing. I want to do the community work." And he said, "Cool. I've been waiting for you to ask that. Now let's get started." And so off we went. I've been doing a lot of work, just sort of bringing the community and the company closer to each other. They already had a lot of their own tools, like discussion platforms and all kinds of online libraries and image sharing at a time when that wasn't normal. Um, my job really was to make sure that they were empowered with new ideas, empowered with support in ways that we could do, and really helping the company to kind of see what was going on out there. And that went from me begging for 1% of the audience to be recognized, the buying audience, to last count was about 45% of their base is now the adults, for 18 plus audience. So Um, and you can see that if you walk down the aisles at a store like Target, right? Where there's some great Star Wars stuff that I love, but also the younger kids love, and all kinds of adult specific, $200-300 kits, right? Which was just almost unheard of when I was there. Um, but yeah, and I left Lego, went out on my own, sold the company to the consulting practice I had for community and uh, social media and that sort of direct customer engagement work. But we sold that to Price Waterhouse and was a partner there for 3 years. And on the way out the door, the Apple recruiter called and said, "Hey, come run the global support community." So I did that for a while, and kind of reshaped that team and that site. And then when I left Apple, I went back to consulting on my own. I've been doing solo practitioner since then, helping companies of all sizes figure out this idea of direct customer engagement, which includes community, but is obviously a lot more than that.
Well, that's quite the ride, isn't it? There's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
So in your day-to-day kind of in current times in your consulting, you mentioned you mentioned a little bit there, but like what is kind of the niche or what is the kind of the sector you're trying to target the most?
Yeah. So for me, I don't really target sectors. Obviously, I end up doing more with technology. I think in some ways that's a easy way for people to think about engaging customers, and it's obviously much more tangible. There's with any sort of technology, there's need for support or use cases, and, sharing of those use cases, that sort of thing. Um, but I've worked with companies like Southwest Airlines on their super user program for their support and travel community. Yeah, I helped design the what is now sort of the foundational piece of the HR block, social media program and community program, uh, Cancer Treatment Centers of America, a number of technology firms, startups, large companies. I mean, I've sort of been all over the map. Um, the, the customer for me tends to be much more about it's a group that is has two situations. One is that they've gone into um, something new and it didn't work well and customers are mad, so they're trying to figure out how do we get out of this hole we've dug for ourselves, or they're in the process of trying to figure out how to grow the business and trying to figure out how to bring in the direct customer engagement piece of some sort. uh, and that may be bringing them into product development cycles to help really give true feedback to that product team as the product's being developed, not just sort of the bookends of before and after, right? Or it could be full blown community program where they're trying to build a offload a community support model, or just basic engagement type of, I don't want to call them influencer programs, but these super user programs. Uh, to really engage people that are just highly interested in the brand, and how do we start to create strategy for not having to do every single event, but to encourage them to maybe go put on some of their own with our support and help, and those kinds of programs. So it's all over the map.
Did you find that your connections through Lego, PwC, and Apple have helped with finding new work in consulting world, or are people finding you, or is it word of mouth?
All of the above.
Okay.
As anybody who's freelance or works on their own knows, you have the kind of the rule of thirds with your work, right? So a third of it is doing the business that you really loved, and you said, "My God, I want to go out on my own and do all this work," right? That's about a third of your time. The other third is running the business itself, so paying taxes, writing checks for bills, whatever it is, and then the last third is finding the next amount of business. And so there's a solid amount of work that goes into that process. The best way is always the networking. People understanding what I'm working on. Whether it's hearing me speak and turning that into a connection, whether it's me sort of reaching out and specifically saying, "Hey, I'm working on something cool. Can you give me some pointers to folks that you know?" And I just that's I do lots of writing on LinkedIn. I do all the normal postings and all that sort of thing that that go into that work. And speak as much as I can, participate in podcasts as much as I can. But realistically, all of this comes down to what's the networking dynamic, right? How am I getting out in front of people and hearing what they have to say, which helps me adjust, what I'm thinking about, what I'm working on, how I'm thinking about what I'm working on. But also to, just to make sure that as much as I can. I give back as much as I can, so that when I need something, that somebody's always willing to lend a hand. Right? It's sort of this everybody goes home happy mantra applying to network, not just community building.
Let's talk quickly about CX sessions. I would love to hear a bit more about that and maybe what the idea behind that was at the start.
Yeah, so let me. I'm going to back up a little bit, and I'll tell you. It was actually an event that started called Dinner Five, and I started it in January 2019. The very short story is I kept showing up at local events for community and for other stuff, but especially for community about 6 7 years ago. And every time I'd show up, there was people that were great and smart, but they were fairly new in their careers, right? The only ones that were sort of coming out and connecting were people that were 6 months, maybe a year and a half into their community career, right? And I finally got to the point where I was just frustrated about that, because I've been doing this, God, coming on 25 years now, right? And there just wasn't a lot of peers. I was doing a lot of mentoring, but I still wanted to learn, right? I still wanted to, have be in the room and be the dumbest person there, right? And I couldn't figure out, as a community nerd, I started thinking, well, why are these senior people not showing up? What's going on there? And so I started talking to a few people, and they all said basically, I'm I'm interested in getting together. I just don't have the time or the compelling reason to do so, and I want some guarantees if I'm going to spend this time asking for the other parent to cover the kids and get out of work early and driving through extra traffic and whatever else it might be. I need a guarantee that when I get there, there's going to be people that are really interesting. That's going to be a good event. And I said, okay, well, this is interesting. And um, but this whole thing started because I was talking to a buddy of mine before all that research over the Christmas holiday 6 7 years ago, and was telling him this frustration. And he said, "Well, what would you want to do?" And I said, "I don't know, like 5 people around my kitchen table with beers and pizza." And he said, "Well, then go do that." It's like, oh yeah, if I want to build community, I've got to build community. What a shocking novel idea for somebody that's been doing this for so long. But it took somebody outside my own head, as so often is the case. And in 2019, I started Dinner Five, which was an in-person, 5-person catered meal, either at Airbnbs when I traveled or at my house when I was at home. And it it was 5 people plus me. All of them were highly curated to make sure that they were really bringing something to the table, that personalities matched, that industries were non-competitive. That basically, as soon as they sat down at the table, with a little light touch facilitation on my part, everybody was warmed up, ready to talk, and excited to really get and into these concepts and issues that they might be having. And I've always called it group therapy rules, right? The conversation goes where it needs to go based on who attends that day. And it's proved wonderfully amazing. And about a year and a half ago or so, maybe almost 2 years now, um, I changed the name, in part because after the pandemic we went to virtual only, and I've stayed virtual only. It's worked really well for this format. um, we moved from catered meals in person to I send a box of curated snacks out to every attendee that are like super cool stuff and interesting pairings and stuff. But there's always food. There's been food at every event, but we just do it a little differently now. But about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I had started to sort of layer in other types of people that were outside of just community work, product support, customer experience, marketing, and those were some of the really interesting uh, conversations. And so I sort of upped that and increased or made it a special sort of um, event that was just for product people, and that was really interesting. But I was like, well, there's still some that was fun, but it was very very product focused, and that's cool too. But also, what happens if I start blending these whole things and just change the whole event to be nothing but a really interesting group of 5 people focused on this idea of direct customer engagement in some form, right? Whether you come to it from product or from marketing or community, either way. And that was absolutely wonderful. I started AI sessions about a year ago because a really cool company called Verticent that does a lot of cloud computing work came to me and said, "Hey, what happens if we were to sponsor you? Could you set up an AI sessions?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely." And so I did a year of AI sessions, and these are once a month events. And so those two ran in parallel. And what I was seeing was both of them were starting to come together, right? That as over the last year, as we all have, we went from AI is something different to AI is interesting to AI is now, something I'm playing with, to now it's sort of integrated in our daily work in many cases, and continues to do more and more of that. But it's still, there was still something sticking out. I know this is a very long-winded story to get to. It is now called AIX sessions. Um, Same idea, 5 people, virtual, all free, box of snacks, um, virtual midday session. But the 5 people are coming from sort of a general walk of life, and with a slightly AI centric focus, right? It's not just pulling AI people together, just talking about AI, but obviously it's sort of more and more built into all that we're doing. And the AIX term, to kind of wrap this long-winded story up, AIX is coming from something that I've been working on the last year or so called AI experience design. This idea of designing the relationship itself between humans and intelligent AI systems, which is what we're seeing a need for more and more, right? There's lots of technology being created, but I think we're still very, very early days in this idea of, what's the, when your systems start creating and behaving and prompting and initiating, sometimes suggesting, these are all human behaviors, and we start to think about them as humanistic systems. And so when that's the case, how do we design that experience? So uh, that's where a lot of my work is going. It's still about building relationships between company and entities outside the company, but whether it's AI or product teams or communities, either way. But yeah, so that's where it's at, and it's a free event. People are welcome to sign up at my jakemckee.com site. But that may be much more than what you were looking for. But that's the story.
That's good. That's good. So, in your consultancy role, I'm always intrigued. How, as a consultant, do you help the teams you're working with kind of learn the skills and point them in the right direction rather than um, doing all the work for them? Like, how are you giving them a fishing rod rather than just giving them fish? Like, could you give us a few ideas of what you can do to make sure that you're kind of setting them up for the long term?
So it's a really good question, because as consultants, I've always called myself a sleeves rolled up consultant. Not a seagull consultant. Which, if you've heard that term, or if you haven't heard that term, it's seagull consultants swoop in, shit on everything, and leave. And you see that sort of work a lot with consultancies, where they'll do a lot of research, and then they'll come in and present you a report, and then you're sort of left on your own to figure out how to implement it. Or they, in theory, will help you implement it, but they're so far removed from the team that it's hard for that. That may help, that separation may be fine or even helpful sometimes in the assessment phases up front. But when my idea, as somebody who's done community in one of the roles that my clients sit in, it it's it's important to really figure out how to not just get them feedback, but action plans for that feedback, right? And so a huge part of the question starts with, are these folks looking for me to teach them? Are they looking for me to help offload? And those are the two first priorities. Because if they're, many of the times that, many of the clients I work for are, wickedly smart people. It's just that there's only so much you can do, and there's only so much you can do for yourself, right? The idea that you can sort of figure out a lot of the problems with your own teams yourself is often very kind of problematic, right? Because as I was just telling the story about AIX sessions, the buddy of mine that said, "Well, just go build that," and I was like, "Oh yeah, I hadn't even thought about doing that," because it was for me, right? I can do it for all kinds of clients. It's harder to do it for myself. And so a lot of clients are in that spot where they're wickedly smart, totally capable, but just don't have the cycles, or just need some outside perspective, or a sounding board that is not worried about the internal politics or whatever it might be. Um, so your question of how do I teach them versus just coming in and directly addressing it, I think starts with this idea of what are they really trying to achieve? Are they just overwhelmed and need some clarity, or are they looking for some time to be taught? I think my goal largely is always to figure out how to how to really get them to understand what I'm doing, but without having to retrain them on everything I've done for them. Uh, and a lot of times that's just them being participatory in the process, creating, instead of just doing, a workshop where I come in and say, "Hey, I've done an assessment. Here's my 5 takeaways. You guys should go fix those. Let's talk about how to fix those." I've got to make it more theirs. And so, how do we get them involved in the participation up front for even doing things like, "Hey, I'm going to go do some research. Help me understand who's there, what's going on with them." And then I'll just kind of talk through, well, here, just so you're clear, here's why I want to talk to somebody from that team, right? Here's what I might want to learn. And you can see and hear in their voices over time that, those concepts are starting to pick in. But, I don't, unless the project is specifically help us learn the thing or help train us to do the thing, it's always sort of a second tier function. It's, I'm here on the team. I'm going to be honest with you about what, is a good idea and what's not a good idea. And I'm going to be as helpful as humanly possible, whether that's the output or the process. Um, and, a lot of times that just sort of naturally defaults to, them seeing how those things played out and go, "Oh, okay, cool." I'll hear a lot of the seeds I plant. I'll hear those show up, a month or two later sometimes.
When we were chatting through your kind of career progression, you mentioned like super user group or advocate groups quite a lot. I'm intrigued to know, like, when you are putting those into place in previous roles or when you're working with brands now, what tools are you using to spot and identify those folk within the community who you can then empower to go on and become your advocates, your super users, whatever you want to call them?
Yeah, so it's a good question, because I think this is, in any of these sorts of things, whether it's a traditional super user program for an online community, or whether it's, what I call community driven product development, this idea of bringing in people from the community, or the passionate customers from the customer base, and giving them a metaphorical and sometimes literal seat at the table for the design, product development process itself. Um, whatever kinds of groups we're talking about, recruitment is often the hardest part of this whole process. I've had processes, recruiting processes that take 3 or 4 months just for the, 4 or 5 people that we'll bring into one of these programs, right? And for me, y- I don't have a lot of good tools. I have a lot of good process. There, beyond some of the, if you're looking for super users in a community platform for that community platform primarily, yeah, you may be able to rely on data more, because you can go look at, who's posting the most, and, that sort of thing. But there's also, depending on the kind of program, the kind of reason you're building these programs, if it's a traditional super user program on a community platform, it's not just the stats, right? It's not just the numbers, because I've had plenty of people who participate wildly on the community that are not the voice and the representative face of the community that I want to see in a super user program.
Busy people.
Yeah, exactly. They can't talk to the
No, and not to be making correct impact that aligns with the values and the feelings of your brand, right?
Yeah, exactly. And every effort that I do, any kind of program I work on, it always starts with, how is this helping the business too, right? This is the everybody goes home happy mantra, that, I have to understand what makes the community happy. I also need to find ways to make them understand what makes me as the company happy. And when we both understand that, it becomes a really wonderful dynamic. But, it's the everybody goes home happy has to be the process. And, that means you got to really understand what makes you happy. What are your goals, right? What's the business trying to do? If they're trying to drive retention that year, for instance, just to pick something random, then the community that you're going out and they're asking, "Hey, I want all this stuff from the company." Great. Well, here's what we're working on this year. Let's figure out how to get both of these things, right? Um, and I think it kind of starts with that everybody goes home happy mantra, um, so that you can figure out what are you really trying to do to make yourself happy. And then secondarily, who are we talking about? What are we trying to do with the program itself? So, even with the product design programs, how you how you select may be very different if you never intend for the customers to directly meet the product development team themselves. Okay, fine. We'll do 40 people. They can be, very truly statistically relevant in their representation. That's very different than, I'm going to put 4 people into somewhere in the middle of Philadelphia in a factory that they're going to show up once a month and actually meet the product designers and talk through things with them and see prototypes. I want to make sure that there's a certain level of communication ability and social connection ability, right? Not just knowledge of the product or the product line. I also want to make sure that when we put them back out into the world after we've done whatever we've done with them, right? Whether they're a super user for a year on a forum or whether they're, in one of these product development cycles for 3 weeks. Either way, when we put them back out into the world and they're empowered to speak about how cool it was that we did these things,
Mm.
how do they speak? Do they do well at representation, right? My all-time favorite program at Lego was the Lego Mindstorms program that was moving from 1.0 to 2.0, right? And 1.0 was 10 years old. There was going to be no backwards compatibility. And I knew immediately that, that there was a segment of our adult community that was going to just lose their minds, and kind of rightfully so, because they'd spent tens of thousands of hours and tens of thousands of dollars to build up their knowledge and their collection around the 1.0 version. This is the robotic system, right? So, and the reality was, in order for us to move forward, a 10-year-old $300 price point product, just you couldn't feasibly pull that into backwards compatibility and get anywhere sort of, dramatically moved forward. And so um, I convinced the product team, after much cajoling, to bring in some fans, and I think they kind of rolled their eyes, and I finally pulled enough political capital to, every shred I had left, really, to convince them that, yeah, okay, fine, we'll do something with them. And I found four guys. One was a mechanical engineer. He ended up submitting, actual like product drawings of, sensor design and whatnot. A software guy who submitted code snippets at one point, as a way to explain his ideas. He went on to work for Lego as a coder after that. An events guy and kind of a general community guy. People that were really well known and represented the community at large. And when we launched, and said, "Hey, here's this new product, and it's not backwards compatible," there was this momentary blip of anger, and the villagers at the castle gates with pitchforks. But it was this momentary blip before they heard, "Oh, those four guys were in this. That Okay, I'm listening now. Okay, tell me more." And the anger sort of shifted from the product issue to real interest, but also it shifted from them being upset about the product changing to, well, why wasn't I invited? I mean, those guys are pretty badass too, but why wasn't I invited, right? And that was a whole different dynamic. But uh,
Hmm.
that's kind of part of this whole process is, how are you designing? Who are you picking based on where they're going to end up? And personality, contribution, representation, ability of the community, and just general personality as much as knowledge can be really important.
When you're working with a new, when you're looking to launch a new community, or you're looking to maybe help re-platform or that kind of thing, I would love to know just the high level steps of the process. Maybe not that yourself was going through, but you as an organization goes through when you're looking to kind of re-platform. Like, how do you pick the right platform for you? Now, I'm aware that there's no correct platform. It's not like one size fits all. Is always going to be a compromise somewhere. But I'm intrigued to know the process that you go through in terms of selecting the correct tool for your community.
Yeah, and I think your setup about, how do we go through program design, very different than specifically like if you're replatforming and you need to find a new platform. If you're building from scratch, I always start with money, right? There's some tiers of cost, and if
Yeah,
I'm not going to
sure.
go in and pitch Koros when all somebody can afford is Circle, right? It's just not. It's a waste of everybody's time. Um, from there, I immediately get out of the way the technology requirements, which may prompt us to go back to the first question. So I've had lots of
Yeah.
people go, "Oh, no, no, put whatever you want in place." And I go talk to IT, and they're like, "No, no, if you don't have an SSO built in this very specific way, then we're not going to allow you to do this at all," right? And immediately that changes the dynamic. And I think those two questions, I try and get at least enough understanding of out of the way up front that I can now figure out how to go start making real choices. Um,
Mhm.
because I've like so many of us, I'm sure I've ended up in spots before where that example of we want to start cheap, and the client that hires me is like, no, we have limited budget, we have limited need, we're just doing a little experiment. And I'm like, all right, cool. And then I get a note saying, actually, we got to rethink this whole thing and figure out how we're going to get on something massive enough to work with our SSO in the right way and meet all of our IT requirements. But yeah, so I think those are two starting points. But I think if you're talking about replatforming, to me that tends to be very different than new platforms. Uh, Replatformings so often are driven by either the client that owns that platform, the community team, the marketing team, whoever it might be that owns the platform itself and uses it, right? Is responsible for it. They've come up short in some way, right? That there's a lack of reporting, there's a lack of scale, there's a lack of features that are important for whatever they're doing. There's something that's driving them, and so really understanding that is almost the starting point of if you need better reporting, we're not going to go to a platform that has less reporting on it, right?
Yeah.
um, the other reality of reprogramming is or replatforming, I mean, is the IT need, right? So the team has come in and said, you're not meeting your obligations for IT security, or we've changed the obligations you're now responsible for, and we've got to do something different. And that and I mention this because those are two very different approaches to how we think about what we're doing. Because if the team comes in and says, and I'm using the SSO example today, but we don't have SSO, and our CTO just required us to make sure that every tool that we have has SSO, or that it's replaced with something else. All right, cool. That's what we're here to do. Then it's a process of figuring out the must-haves, right? So when we do start assessing, then it's both a tech and a use case set of requirements. Because any platform, you gain things and you lose things, and that's always a challenge to manage. But that's very different than again, somebody saying, we had a community that was focused on A, we want to kind of refocus it, but in order to do that, we need more tools, or we're refocusing, and that's giving us a chance to fix something, right? And that really tends to drive a lot of those assessment processes. And then after that, it's really it's kind of all the same uh, process of feature comparison and technology options and cost and uh, implementation realities, professional service support during and after the launch, all those sorts of things that become fairly common.
Similar to lots of the tech world, some products can have surprisingly short shelf lives, right? Like something launches, it might be around for a few years, and then unfortunately they can't raise again, or they don't build enough momentum. Do you find, like, if you're working with an enterprise customer, it would almost be risky to feel like to select something that hasn't been around long enough and isn't quite mature enough? Does that limit the number of options you have when you're recommending a choice? Like, there's only really a couple of handfuls of choices, right?
It does, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think that this idea that it's the product hasn't been around a while, it, the willingness to make change happen.
Mm.
So if I'm a smaller company, I might be willing to come in and say, yeah, we'll put in something cheap and new because it seems interesting. We're willing to take that risk because our audience is 100 people, and they're so focused on the product that we feel confident that if we switch to another platform, we won't lose everybody, right? That I think we'll be okay. So we'll start small and then grow into what we need. If you go into a big company, they tend to say no, unless it's got a certain level of history of validation, technical validation, security features and agreements in place. We're not putting it anywhere near our stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so that tends to require some of those larger tools like Coros. Uh, that a smaller company just doesn't need that much power, so to speak. Um, but it does, it's very hard to sell in smaller, newer tools to bigger companies because of all those, inherent requirements. And
Yeah.
it's a risk, right? It's a risk for the team that is asking for money. Teams only want to ask for money once, and most teams would rather ask for more money once than a bunch of money multiple times because it makes them seem like they didn't know what they were doing in the beginning. And even if it was completely strategic to say, no, no, we're just getting started, this is our pilot tool, and then we're going to grow into something else. In big political driven organizations, hearing, oh yeah, we're switching is a sign of problem, an inherent sign of problem. It may not actually be one, but it feels like that to other people who don't know any better. And so, people tend to think, okay, how am I going to get the leading best in class, and then make that pitch to my bosses? Because who wants to buy new and when they can buy, best in class, if you've got, the money to do so, or the ability to do so. So, it's a spectrum. I've always sort of thought about them as a basic small, medium, low, or sorry, small, medium, high. So high is the big choruses. The mediums are more of the discourse. They've been around a while. They're stable, but they have kind of a more specific audience. And it's perfectly fine if you're putting that in place for Intel's developer community, because developers love discourse for some reason. And it may not be as effective if you're putting it in place for a support community for consumer products of some sort, right? Maybe, depending on how you design it. But and then you've got the small tier is much more of these smaller, the upstarts, or much more small footprint platforms, right? And I think it's really fast, really fast to figure out which tier are we looking at, right? If I get a startup that doesn't have any money, then we're going to the small tier. We're never even going to consider medium or large. They just don't have the money for it. And if I get a Fortune 500 company, we're almost certainly going to stay in the large tier,
Yeah.
you know, or at least the very high medium if we get out of that large tier. But uh, that part's not as challenging as what's really fueling their interest or choices or demands.
Jake, how are you? What are you reading? What are you listening to? What are you watching to kind of sharpen your community sword, per se?
In the last couple of years, I've really been sort of reframing my thinking around what community is, to this idea of direct customer engagement. And I think that community has never really, as an industry, I don't really think found its place in the organization independently. And I don't know that we as an industry did anything wrong really, or that we could have done something differently to end up in a different place. I think in a lot of ways, what was required early on in community space was for us to be kind of a sequestered thing, to be able to give it some power and some depth of knowledge and some understanding for people that don't understand what that was, right? So it wasn't that long ago when you tell normal people what a community was, they'd be like, "What are you talking about?" Now it's fairly standardized, right? People know it and get it. But I think there's a lot of talk about the chief community officer and that sort of thing, and I've never really felt like that was going to be any sort of reality. I always felt like there was a chief customer officer that included several things, including community and beyond, right? Is the these product development programs that I do, where we're bringing customers together with product developers during development. Is that community? Well, it's a form of community, absolutely, by my higher level thinking about community. But it is really direct customer engagement. How do we directly engage with customers to pull them in and work more closely with us to understand more things? And so the whole point of that is that I've been doing a lot more attention to non-community activity and content in the last few years than community content. Everything from communications and PR to sort of non-traditional marketing principles, and honestly, any more AI and what AI is doing, and really thinking about um, what that means for us as we get faster and better at very simple tasks like having it be our creative and critical partner writing content, but also thinking about stuff where in the not too distant future, we community people would have the ability to create virtual groups and pre-launch announcements to see what the reaction might be and how to prepare for how we're going to communicate, how we're going to think. What's is this going to spike our moderation needs, right? And how do we schedule against that? Um, how do we take moderation out of the mix in the same way that we've been doing it much more manually, and get really good at letting AI take on some, and in some cases all of the moderation tasks, so that we can free up and do and I say moderation, I mean low level moderation, not more of the engagement style moderation. But I don't want my community manager doing massive amounts of event programming and follow-ups and all that stuff. I'd much rather than be actually hosting those events, or engaging about those events and doing that sort of thing. And so, I think there's a lot of stuff going on there. But the stuff that really does interest me is this kind of this modeling of behavior. So we've got an LLM, and we can train it specifically in our community, and let's throw something out and see what happens. Oh man, I didn't think they were going to react this way. Or to be able to show our colleagues, hey, we have such a deep understanding through our community of our customer base. Watch this. You pull
Yeah,
up your custom GPT and show it what happens when they ask any question, and then compare it to what happens when you actually go ask it in real life, and how close that might be, right?
very
I
cool.
think there's a lot of really interesting things along those lines. And I will say loudly and repeatedly, community people have a really interesting perspective and skill set and background in the coming era of AI, right?
Mhm.
If we move to a place where you're reducing the workload required eight hours before, and now you can do in two, you got to make a case for why you were valuable enough to stick around for the other six, right? And not just lay you off and replace you with somebody cheaper, smaller, smaller hour count, right? But that every company is grappling with this and will grapple with it in years to come. But I think we are uniquely positioned as people who really understand customers, who understand how to communicate uh, with difficult systems, um, and generally speaking, have an eye towards this idea of relationship building, both with the systems, with people that are using the systems. How does that work empower a lot of what we're doing as we fundamentally work on completely reshuffling our workflows and our processes internally and externally. um, there's going to be needs for people who really understand human relationships in these processes of moving away from relying solely on human relationship to get work done. How do we keep those dynamics in place? It's this AIX concept is, how are we designing to take full advantage of AI, but also doing it in a way that keeps our humanity, creates opportunity and process for using that 6 hours to be more innovative, to do more interesting things. And I wish there was community people around when the web was coming up, right? Because we would have thought about what kinds of products and how to build those products much differently and much, I think, more rapidly, had we had people trained in what we do, present at that time, right? And so, yeah, I think we're uniquely situated. I empower everybody to really start thinking about what you can do with AI. Sure, it's scary, and there's some concerns for sure, but also there's some really fascinating things that we can be thinking about. And I think being at the forefront of that's going to be really important to keep our relevancy, so to speak, and to be empowered to lead as well, and not just be part of the system.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you for your time today. Um, for chatting. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insights from the last many years of your career. And yeah, where's the best place for people to find you online if they want to reach out, ask a question, or kind of see what you're up to?
Yeah, all of my stuff's at jakemckee.com. I'm sure you'll put that in the show notes, but
Yeah.
you can sign up for the AIX Sessions event there. You can find out more about AIX and the community-driven product development, as well as just reach out and say hello.
Thank you. Cheers, Jake. This is the Digital Community Leaders Survey 2023. And this is the Digital Community Leaders Survey 2023 second edition. Back in 2023, we released a beautiful printed book. And due to its popularity, we sold out of printed copies. Rather than reprinting, we listened to your feedback and we included 40% more content in this copy. We created the report to be a data-backed handbook for building the foundations of your brand's community. For instance, did you know that 70% of communities we surveyed saw growth over the last 12 months? And we know those businesses are growing too. Other metrics we dive into include community growth, biggest pain points, community purpose, what are other community managers measuring, funding, participation, C-suite involvement, and much more. In this book, we present the data and expert insights from Richard Gott, Michelle Goodall, Vincent Boone, Keen Bakatari, Rosie Sherry, Matt Sullivan, Laura Roth, Nicole Saunders, Blaise Grimes-Vaught, and Jan Carlisle. We've also included frameworks such as the community archetypes, ecosystem of impact, community participation ladder, and the community first culture nexus. There's so much in here, I can't wait for you to get your hands on this new edition. You can order your printed copy from Amazon today or download a digital copy for free at digitalcommunityleaders.com.